من بره. ضيفتنا النهارده من النمسا، وهي انيميتور وارت دايركتور عندها خبره كبيره، وافلامها اترشحت للبافتا اللي هي جايزه الافلام البريطانيه، واشتغلت في استوديوهات كتيره وليها فيجوال ستايل كولرفul جدا ومليان تكستشرز، يعني بتعبر عن التكستشرز، بتعبر عن الاحاسيس بطريقه كويسه جدا وطريقه مختلفه جدا. وكمان درست في الرويال كوليدج اوف ارتس في انجلترا، ودرست حاجه يمكن مش كلنا بنسمع عنها، وهي الانيميتد دوكيومنتريز، عملت ماسترز فيها. فده اللي هتكلمنا عنه النهارده. ده برانش من الانيميشن، او يعني اتجاه في الانيميشن يمكن يكون جديد شويه، بس هو ظريف جدا وفيري افكتيف في مجالات مختلفه هنسمع طبعا منها عنها كلها يعني. وهي هتكلمنا ماستر كلاس عن الانيميتد دوكيومنتريز. فعايز ارحب جدا بضيفتنا من النمسا برعايه المعهد الثقافي النمساوي كاثرين شتاينباخر.
Hello. Thanks, Johanna, for the introduction. I could understand a couple of different bits like color and texture and BAFTA. So thanks so much for the introduction. My name is Kathrin Steinbacher. I'm an animation director and illustrator, and I'm based in London, so that's why I've been living in the last 9 years. And that's also where I've studied. So I studied illustration animation at the Kingston School of Arts, and then I did an MA in animated documentaries at the Royal College of Art. So yeah, thanks so much for the invitation, Johanna, and also thanks to the Austrian Cultural Forum who invited me today to speak to you about animated documentaries. And when you first invited me, I didn't realize that this room would be such a big room. So I'm really excited, but also, to be honest, I'm a bit terrified, but I'm sure it's going to be fine. So animated documentaries. Let's go to the next slide. So animated documentaries is something that I'm really passionate about, especially because I'm really interested in finding new ways to represent the reality, to represent actuality. Because it is a genre that exists for a very long time now. But in the last couple of years, a lot of really, really exciting films got produced because a lot of animation directors found new and really exciting ways to represent and show actuality. So I think a really good way to start this talk is by showing some of my own work, because I'm pretty sure you guys are not very familiar with the work I do. So as I said, I work as a animation director, but I also teach at the University for Creative Arts in Canterbury. But I also have worked on a couple of different personal films in the past, and also commissioned films. So I'm going to show you 3 different films to start this talk in the beginning. So the first 2 films I'm going to show you the first film I'm going to show you is actually a commission we did for the Victorian Albert Museum in London. And it is an animated documentary. It's actually a really exciting project because it talks about the reality. It is an animated documentary called Victorian Albert Museum. They called it V&A Innovate. And it was this project where they invited school kids and young teenagers to walk around in their communities and to find a problem. And then they asked them to find a solution to this problem, a design solution. And they contacted us, I think it was last year, and asked us to produce 3 different animated documentaries that talks about 3 different objects in their, which they have in their museum, in their archive. And I don't know if you've ever been to the Victoria and Albert Museum or if you have ever been to London, but they have this really, really amazing archive. And the first object is a fridge. So they have this fridge, a designer from India designed years ago. And this fridge was designed for rural areas in India because they don't have access to electricity. So he had to come up with an idea for a fridge that doesn't need electricity. And this first film, talks about the history of the fridge and why he came up with that solution. So I'm going to show you the first film.
Months of high projecti noticed a problem. Food was going to waste in rural Indian communities, where some people couldn't access electricity or afford refrigerators. So, he designed the Miti-Cool fridge. Made from terracotta clay, it keeps the contents cool using the traditional technique called evaporative cooling. The top of the fridge is filled with water. It evaporates through the porous clay, and heat energy is transferred away from the inside chamber, leaving them cool. Not needing electricity or using fossil fuels, but is affordable and sustainable. Sometimes we don't need to reinvent the wheel to solve a problem. What could you redesign?
So the challenge was to tell this story in a very short amount of time because we only had 1 minute to tell the story. And that, especially when it comes to animated documentaries, is a very short amount of time. Generally speaking, in filmmaking, if you want to tell a story, a minute is not very long. So this is the second film called Sitting on Recycling. And this film talks about these really beautiful chairs they have in their collection. And those designs were designed by recycled materials. So different designers walked around in their communities and they collected all the rubbish they found, and then they turned it into something really beautiful, into like these amazing looking chairs.
Can we turn something that might have become trash into something we treasure? Recycled packing crates, simply screwed together. Found parts from a gas pipe, tractor, a wheelchair and bicycle. Tractor, a wheelchair and bicycle.
Sorry about that.
Tractor, a wheelchair.
I actually might have it on my laptop as well, so if that's easier. I don't have the other one on. I have this one on my laptop and not the other one. So let me. All right. So the films I've just shown you, as I just said, are commissions. The next film I want to show you is this one called The Woman Who Turned into a Castle. Loading. Oh yeah, here it is. So this was a film I created in my second year at the RCA. So it is a student film. And looking at this film now is quite difficult for me, especially because I see all different mistakes and things I want to do differently now. But I think it's really, really important to show the first films a filmmaker has produced, because it's really good to look back and reflect and also see how you changed and how you hopefully progressed. So to give you a bit of context, The Woman Who Turned into a Castle doesn't really sound like an animated documentary, but it is based on a true story. So it's based, the inspiration was Rose. So Rose was living in the 1920s, and she was in her early 20s. I think she was 21. She was living in New York, and she was this really young, energetic, young woman. She was a flapper, and a flapper at the time were these women who started to dress differently. She was cutting her hair, she started to smoke, so she was quite rebellious. And at the time in the 1920s, loads of people got sick. They all suffered from this disease called encephalitis lethargica, also called the sleeping disease. And that really mysterious disease happened at the same time the Spanish flu happened. And lots of people died, but the people who didn't die basically froze. So, I mean, their eyes were still open, but they couldn't move anymore, they couldn't talk anymore. So this really scary, frightening thing happened to Rose. So she basically froze. But she survived. And in the 1960s, Oliver Sacks is a really famous, or was a really famous, British neuroscientist. He came to New York and he found loads of survivors of that sleepy disease. And he started to experiment with a drug called L-Dopa. And what happened is that lots of people suddenly woke up. And this was a project in collaboration with the Wellcome Collection in London. And the Wellcome Collection also has this really amazing medical archive. And I went there and I found her case. And I also found live action footage of her after she woke up talking about it. So, but the really striking thing was that many people in the 1960s, after they woke up, decided to stop the medication and to go back into that frozen state, which I found terrifying, but really fascinating at the same time, because you have to imagine she fell asleep when she was 21 and she woke up as an old lady. And loads of things happened in the meantime. The TV was invented and the first man landed on the moon, for instance. So I was really interested in the question, life, yes, but to what extent? And then I ended up making this film called The Woman Who Turned into a Castle, which is, if you know Oliver Sacks' work, very much inspired by his books. One of his books is called The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, for instance. So let's see, I'm really hoping that this is working now. If not, I'm going to show you the trailer instead. Yeah, I'm sorry about that. I don't think this is working. Let's see if I can show you the trailer instead. Okay, I think it's not working. I just have to show it in a different quality, but which isn't ideal, but you know, things like that happen. So yeah, let's see. Okay, thank you. So coming back to the initial question, why we should why animation is a successful medium in representing the actuality, in representing reality. So as I said, it's not a new genre. So this is the first film, The Sinking of the Lusitania by Winsor McCay, that was produced in 1918. And it is considered by historians to be the first animated documentary. I don't know if you have seen this, but it's basically, it was a ship that sank, and then he reproduced it, used animation to show that event, to show that historical event. And at the time, I mean, not at the time, but now it is considered to be a propaganda film. So that was the reason initially why he created animated documentary, was because they didn't take any photos, they didn't film it, so he had to reproduce it as an animation. So that was the very first animated documentary considered by historians. I mean, since then, loads of things happened and the genre evolved dramatically, and loads of like filmmakers used this medium to tell stories in a very unique and very evoking way. And I'm sure you have seen some of the films. Recently, one of the films I really liked was Flea, and it's by this Dutch filmmaker called, I always have to look it up because his name is just never sticks with me, Jonas Poher Rasmussen, and has won loads of different prizes, got nominated for BAFTA last year, and has been screened around the world. So if you haven't seen it, I really recommend watching it. But it's really unique, and he tells the story of this young Pakistani refugee. He fled as a young boy, and he ended up in the Netherlands, and he has kept hidden for over 20 years. And in this animated documentary, he talks about his story for the very first time. So why is animation a suitable medium for this genre? That's something I really want to talk to you about today. And sometimes it's probably going to be a bit theoretical, but hopefully it doesn't get too boring. I'm trying my best. But I think to really understand why animation should be used, we have to look into a couple of questions. So why and how is animation representing the reality differently? How and why is animation being used of conventional alternatives? And I am, as a filmmaker, I am especially interested in how animation can visualize rare human states. And this sounds a bit abstract, but what I mean by that is when I say rare human conditions and subjective experiences, I mean things such as depression, things such as autism, things that you as an audience probably haven't really experienced yet. So it's something that is really difficult to imagine. And you can, for instance, interview somebody who has dementia, and you can probably try to understand and emphasize with this person by observing, their facial features, but it's really difficult, I argue, to really understand what is going on internally. And what the medium can really do is to visualize the internal and to bring it really to the surface. And in this talk, I'm going to talk about different ways of doing that. This is the first animated documentary I worked on. I created in 2017. This was my graduation film from the Kingston School of Art called Freedom. And it's a very personal film. It's based on my younger brother who used to be a professional skier. And I'm Austrian, so we grow up skiing. We learn skiing from a very young age. So it's very much part of our cultural identity, especially if you're from the western part of Austria. And but then he stopped, and it was a really difficult time for him. So we sat down and we talked about it, and I recorded that conversation, and then we both decided to create this animated documentary. But at the time, I didn't realize that what I was making was an animated documentary, because at the time, tutors didn't really teach anything about animated documentaries. It was just something I did. But I got really interested in the medium, and then I decided to go to the RCA to study animated documentary because I really wanted to learn more about the medium. And the first thing, if you're interested in animated documentaries, the first thing you probably will discover is this book. And I really recommend getting it because it's a really amazing book by Annabelle Honus-Rowe. And she was actually the first person who has written about animated documentaries. And she is talking in her book why animation is suitable, and is questioning whether animation might be a threat. So this is one quote of her book. She's saying, while animation might at first seem to threaten the documentary project by destabilizing its claim to represent reality, she suggests that the opposite is the case. Animation, in part through its material differences from live action, shifts and broadens the limit of what and how we can show about reality by offering new and alternative ways of seeing the world. And this is a little bit related to what I was talking about before, when, you know, in more like in live action, you have the photographic image, but animation, as you probably all know, has no boundaries. So you can do whatever you want to do. Things can morph into other things, you can exaggerate things, you can use different materials, different textures to really tell the story. And if you ask people oftentimes who have never really thought about animated documentaries, and if you ask them why animation is suitable, they often would come up with these 3 points. So the first one is to potentially show a sensitive content, something that is too difficult to see in live action, such as abuse or sexual assault. And then the second thing is we want to show something that can't be filmed, such as a war scene or courtrooms. And you know, you have loads of like reportage illustrators that go into the courtroom to illustrate when the camera and when the press aren't allowed, or to recreate historical events, such as the example I've shown you before, the first animated documentary. But animation can do so much more than, you know, just showing sensitive content, historical events, or the war or courtroom. It can really represent the eternal. It can really show emotions, feelings, and abstract states. And this is what I want to talk about today. So why animation and how? I'm going to talk about 2 different things. So the first thing is how the use of metaphors, lines, textures, and perspective can show reality, and then how potentially abstraction can show the internal. So the first thing I'm going to talk about, lines and textures in animated documentaries. And so first of all, I want to ask you, before I'm going to start showing you more stills of this film, I want to ask you how lines and textures can serve as metaphors. Can a line, for instance, communicate a feeling? What medium is appropriate for certain topics and themes? Can line function as a narrative, for instance, or help you to make your narrative clearer? These are all questions I always like to ask myself before I start making a film, because I think the story should always come first. And then based on the story, I would always decide later on the material, on the appropriate medium. So I'm going to talk about a short animation called The Hat by Michel Cornier. And this film is from '99. I'm not going to show the film today because it's actually quite a sensitive content. But if you want to, if you're interested, it's online and you can watch it later. So as I said, it's by this Canadian filmmaker. I have been incredibly inspired by her, called Michel Cornier. And the film is all hand-drawn with black ink on paper, and the film shows how an exotic dancer is recalling the sexual abuse she suffered during childhood. And I also would like to advise you to focus on the medium and the textures and line as well when I show you the following slides. So what she's doing in her film very much is she's using a lot of metaphors. So things are morphing from one symbol to the other. We have the hat that is morphing into a body. We have her face morphing into a ballerina. And this morphing is very much the main thing that is going on in the film. So the victim's naked body is grabbed, observed, and bent to the whim of the abuser, who is depicted in the form of a hat. So the abuser is basically the hat. So the hat is the metaphor for the abuser. and the morphing changes as she gets abused. So the purpose of this animation was to visualize the victim's emotions and feeling, and really functions in a very evocative way. So Cornier invites the audience to feel and understand the pain of the naked woman, who constantly changes her form by morphing into other metaphorical images. And this really allows the audience to imagine the world from the main character's perspectives. So Cornier applies different techniques to evoke the audience imagination, such as hand-drawn animation, which is a very appropriate medium for the subject matter because it's very simple. She uses very simple brush strokes, but she's adding a lot of pressure, for instance, when the abuse is happening. We have omissions in representative forms, and it all reveals aspects of a really difficult experience that probably not, or hopefully not many people will understand, because if you haven't experienced it, it's probably really difficult to understand what it feels like after. And what is really interesting is that Michelle Cornier, she adds, as I mentioned before, a lot of pressure when the rape is actually happening. And I found a quote. She was saying, "I was breaking my pens. When there was violence, I was very hard with my brushes. I was wearing them out." And what is particularly striking about the brush strokes, the rough brush strokes, is that the viewer immediately notices Cornier's close and intimate relationship with the drawings, because she uses an actual pen and she was drawing on paper. When the character in the film is feeling pain, she added pressure to the drawings and therefore literally embedded the pain in her own wrist. She has also done extensive research. So she interviewed women who experienced something similar. She went into bars, she observed stances, and so she did loads of extensive research. And she describes this process of internalizing her research and exploring the main character's pain by physically putting herself into the shoe of the main character as autofiction. And I found a quote that explains this a bit better. She said, "I rotoscoped myself mentally in my head. I used myself as a life model. Once I've put myself in the scene, it's more direct. It becomes all," she says, "I become all the characters in my drawings. I dig deep into my emotion and personal experiences." So one could argue that you can probably never achieve the same thing in live action. And this is something you can only do in animation, in the drawn image. So yeah, that's the one thing. I mean, this is like, for example, a GIF. So this is one scene where, as you can see, the brush strokes really change. It gets really rough, and you can see smudges and smears and splatters, and it really serves as a metaphor for the pain. So anybody looking at the pain, not anybody looking at the pain, anybody looking at the strokes can probably completely understand what it means, because gentle lines are very probably relaxing and you probably feel at ease, whereas the other ones, the jagged lines, they probably mean something different. They probably mean something is not quite right, so something, or maybe there is a problem. So what also is very interesting is that Cornier conceptualizes balance. So it's a concept we all are aware from a very young age. So if you think about things like, you know, we say, oh, he or she looks very balanced, or this has a really good, strong foundation. We all know what it means. But if somebody is losing balance, is laying down, it could also mean that the person is probably dead. So she's using that quite a lot. So the main character is bending and moving and morphing. So this is also quite interesting, I think. And yes, so this is basically the first thing I wanted to talk about. how lines can serve as metaphors for the internal and hopefully bring it to the surface and make the audience understand a little better. The second one I want to talk about is abstraction. I mean, something animation can do really well, because in animation you can strip away information you don't need. So you can abstract things really well. And I was always really interested in how abstracting something can help you to visualize something very concrete. So I want to show you another film called Listen by two filmmakers, Maribel Fernandez and Alexander Bernard. And it's a film about an autistic child. It's a film about a non-verbal autistic child, which is actually quite rare, because I think only 20 to 25% of children who have autism can't talk or can't express through words. So that film is about this very specific, or is about this very specific condition. And before I talk about it, I want to show you the film first. Okay, so I'm going to stop here. So what Listen does, it translates something that is very difficult to imagine to abstract shapes. Because if you think about it, it's something that can't really be presented as a metaphor or as a photographic image, because how could you represent something so abstract? Because, if you've never experienced, it's probably difficult to imagine. So they translated that feeling of not being able to express, and also the sensitivity to sound, to abstract shapes. What is also very interesting is, in the beginning, it starts with a live action footage. It starts with the van, the spinning van. And I don't know if you know, but some autistic children are really obsessed with spinning things, because if you're really oversensitive to sound or the world in general, it likes to help them to focus and to feel a sense of calm. And because they start with the live action footage, it makes the audience realize that, okay, we're talking about something that is real, we're talking about the reality. And then later, they go straight into abstract shapes. In the beginning, you don't really understand what the shapes are representing, but after a while, you start to experience, or you start to realize that these abstract shapes represent the internal world, and especially represent the sensitivity to sound. What some people argue as well, which is quite interesting, is that if you abstract something, if you take things away, you have to look closer. Because as you see here, it's very, very reduced. So it's really difficult to understand what the meaning is. So some people say it really steers your imagination, which this film does really well, I think. So that's another example. Oh, okay, now it stopped working completely. Johanna, I think your Wi-Fi is not connected anymore to the presentation. Okay. Let's try something just to make sure that this is loading, because this is also a film I want to show in the end. Yeah, I think let's hope it's loading, otherwise I'm going to show something else. Oh yeah, I'm going to show this one if the other one is not working. Okay, because this doesn't seem to work. Okay. Okay, sorry again. And that concept of abstracting things can also apply to character design. So this is an image by Scott McCloud, and Scott McCloud was this, or is this very famous comic book author, comic book illustrator. And he was saying that it really helps if you strip away all information you don't need when it comes to character design, because loads more people can identify with the character, because we all have the same features. We have two eyes, we have a nose and a mouth, and then it doesn't really matter, everybody can relate, he argues, because it doesn't matter what skin color you have or what cultural background you come from. So, and the next film I want to show you is actually my film called In Her Boots, because I want to show that I made the film, but I was very much inspired by the two films I showed earlier. And I was using a lot of visual metaphors similar to The Hat and also Listen. So fingers crossed that this film is working now. If not, I'm going to show you a different film. So to give you a bit of context, so this is based on or inspired by my own grandmother's story. She was suffering, or she is suffering from dementia. And she was always a very independent, a very stubborn woman, and has this great sense of humor. And at the time, she started to forget things. So she started to suffer from dementia. And what happened in my family was that, first of all, actually, I have to tell you a fact, and which is that she had these really old hiking shoes. So she was always obsessed with her red hiking boots, but they were almost falling apart. They were really old and had like holes in it, and my family wanted to buy her new ones. But she didn't want to let go of the old ones, and so she refused. And as family members, you always want the best for somebody. But what was really an issue for her was that she felt that that possibility of making her own decision was taken away. And from an outside perspective, this sounds like something so small, but it was something that was so big to her because, as I said, she thought she didn't have the power to make her own decisions anymore. So that was the whole starting point of the film. And then the second question I had before I started making the film was whether it would be possible to suffer from dementia but still maintain independency and autonomy. And this was based on a lot of research I have done, because researchers in Japan actually found out that if you give people with dementia the possibility to decide for themselves, the disease progresses slower. So that was very interesting fact when I started making the film. And these are the different metaphors in the film: the hiking shoes, the red hiking boots. So the shoes symbolize her independence and her ability to maintain her autonomy despite her old age, but also is a metaphor for her being able to remember again. Then the journey, the hiking shoes, show the struggle of her dementia disease. The snow, as you've probably seen in the film, shows memory loss. So everything gets a bit blurry. She doesn't know where she is. I mean, that's a general thing in the film, that oftentimes you don't really know what is happening. You don't really know where you are, and things move from one thing to the other. So I was trying to put the audience into her perspective. The balance, so she loses balance. We talked about balance earlier. And then the lines and textures. So everything is very rough, everything is very textured, because we're talking about a very raw human emotion here. So these are some of the stills in the film. As I said, the snow, the journey, the balance. So when she's losing balance, her face is basically flying away, so she doesn't remember who she is anymore. She loses her identity. And then the hiking boots, the textures and lines. So yeah, I mean, this is basically what I wanted to talk to you about, was the use of metaphors, was the use of lines and textures, and how potentially abstraction can help you to visualize the internal when it comes to animation, specifically when it comes to animated documentaries. So thank you. Oh yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to ask.
حد عنده أسئلة؟
Sorry, this is a bit of an off-topic question, but is the animation industry active in German-speaking countries like Germany, Austria, and Switzerland? Like, how is the animation industry there?
Yes, so that's Austrian German, so probably very difficult to understand. I mean, it is German, but probably very difficult to understand for somebody from Germany, because it is a very strong dialect, especially this one. The animation industry, I mean, I studied in the UK, so I don't know too much about it, but there is an animation industry. It's very small, so everybody knows everybody, and you can actually study animation in Vienna. So, and you have really amazing animation festivals like Tricky Women Festival, 2 Days Animation Festival, Vienna Shorts. So there are things definitely going on, but it's very small and very much, so very traditional. So the animation techniques people are using, especially at the University of the Applied Arts in Vienna, is very traditional because it's very much rooted in painting, and the course is also called painting, but you can actually also do animation. Yeah.
Hello. Where can we find your PhD or master's degree research about animated documentary, to read it or to take a look?
Where I found it. So, I mean, the reason why I went to the Royal College of Art was because they have, you can specialize in animated documentaries. So, and tutors, they very much help you to find the right resources. So if you go to the library and if you type in animated documentaries, probably the first thing that comes up is the book by Honus Rowe called Animated Documentaries. So yeah, the tutors there were really helpful to give me the right references and things to look at. But also, in the UK, the industry when it comes to animated documentary, I mean, it's still very small, but there are things going on. For instance, there's this website called Animated Documentaries where tutors and professors recently publish articles, oftentimes very theoretical. But what I found in the beginning was that, I mean, I always hated writing a dissertation. I always didn't really like writing in a more theoretical context. But once I started to make it relatable to my practice, it made a lot of sense, and then it eventually made my practical work a lot stronger as well, I think.
Hi, I wanted to ask, how long did it take you in the pre-production process and the post-production process?
For the last film I've just showed?
Yes.
Okay. So that was my graduation film, so we had a year to make this. I mean, a little less than a year. So I was probably working on the concept and the story from September to January. And then I was working on the film. I was producing and making all the animation. I mean, if you study at the Royal College, you're working in very small teams, so most of it is animated by myself, and I had a couple of people who helped with the coloring. So I had probably 4 months for the production to finish the animation, and then probably a couple of weeks to work on the sound and the music. Yeah, but a little less than a year in total, I would say.
Hello. How to find my own style and my own way to express my ideas and emotions. How did you choose that?
Do you mean when it comes to the visual language, or are you talking about the themes and the topics you want to explore?
The coloring, the art style.
Okay. Yeah. So I studied illustration. So I'm very much so my background is very much based in illustration and reportage illustration. So this is how I started. So the way I developed my own visual language was by basically walking around and drawing from real life. And then after that, I did a lot of reading. I was looking into lots of different theories that talk about, color and metaphors. And based on that, I guess I developed that visual language. But oftentimes, what I like to think about is the theme and the idea first, and then based on what I want to say, I then gonna decide on the visual language. If I'm gonna use a lot of colors, or if it's very minimal, if it's very stripped away, similar to the hat, for instance. To give you a bit more of a specific example, in her boots, for instance, because it talks about a very difficult topic, and I wanted to make a film that is a bit more light-hearted, because my grandma is, you know, this very strong person and has a lot of humor, and she still has a very good life and she still has a very good time. So that's why I decided to make it really colorful, to talk about an issue that is difficult, but in a hopefully bit of a light-hearted way, visually, but also, thematically.
First of all, your work is very beautiful. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks.
And it's very touching. I wonder, how do you conduct your research? Like how, in Listen, since they are radiotastic.
So how do you touch, what was the last sentence?
How do you conduct your research?
How I conduct my research? I mean, that's a really good question. I guess as a filmmaker, you have to find your own methodology. I mean, this film was based on very personal observations. So it was based on, I was basically writing down and drawing my grandma. I was writing down the things I observed. So this was the first type of research I have done. So my own very personal observations. And then I went on, and then I started to learn and read about dementia in general, but also I was very interested in the way dementia is seen in the society and how we can potentially improve the lives of somebody who has dementia. So I did a lot of Googling, I was reading like a lot of studies, listening to podcasts. So it really depends on the project, because for the Victorian Albert Museum, for instance, the research we had to do is basically we had to go to the museum, we had to look at the objects, we had to talk to the curator, and she explained, you know, how that object was being created and what the history of the object is. So it was already there at one place. That was quite easy, but sometimes, you know, you have to walk around and find information at different places and then make up your own mind, which, you know, can be really confusing in the beginning. You know, you can get lost in all the research in the beginning of a project, but once you know what you want to say, I think it gets easier. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hello.
Yes, hi. So your work is very fascinating to me. Actually, it's very beautiful. And I just wonder if you have any advice for someone who's pursuing this kind of career, because I'm in architecture, engineering, and I'm thinking of shifting my career to graphic design. And I already took pictures for the book and the documentaries that you mentioned. And I'm gonna do my research on them, and I'm just wondering if you have any extra advice for someone who's like pursuing this, and things that you wish you knew when you first started your career, wish you knew like then, you would give an advice for,
Okay, I think it's great that you want to do it. I mean, if it, you know, if this is something you feel really passionate about, you should definitely do it. I think at the beginning when I started out, I did. In the UK, it's like an art and design foundation. You have to do that before you actually go on and study, and when you do your BA. So it was a requirement. So that's what I did. And in the beginning, I think the biggest issue was, first of all, to find your own voice, but also to gain that self-confidence. So, and I think because worrying and being anxious in the beginning is, you know, it's quite a big thing, because you have loads of people around you who are really amazing, and it is a very competitive area. But if you really want to do it, then you can definitely make it work. And I think it's just trying out loads of different things and having fun and experimenting with loads of different potential outcomes and processes, and yeah, basically have fun. And that sounds a bit cliche always, but also make mistakes, because this is how you learn and this is how you improve and this is how you get better. But I guess if you have the right people around you, the right people who push you in the right direction and see things that you can't see for yourself, things that you're potentially good at, then you can improve. So yeah, just find good mentors, I think, is something that I would advise.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi, I really enjoyed this session. I'm not into animation, I'm just asking for a friend, but I liked this session a lot. What are the programs and the tools and also the books you have read before doing your last film? That's it, thank you.
Yeah, so I used different methods. So it's a bit crazy, but it's all animated in Photoshop, but I would not recommend doing that again, because Photoshop is not the best software to animate. But so I really still like Photoshop for coloring, because it really allows you to use really organic brushes. So that's what I still do, is that I animate it in a different software, TV Paint, and then I'm gonna import it to Photoshop, and then I color it in Photoshop to produce that hand-rendered look and to have all these textures if needed. And there are some scenes in the film that were animated on paper, especially the zoom in of the shoe. That's all animated and colored on paper. And yes, so Photoshop, TV Paint, and hand-drawn animation on paper. On mental health, Elizabeth is Missing was a book I read. It's a fictional book. It's a story about this woman who starts to lose her memories. And in the film, you probably noticed, or you might not have, you have post-it notes everywhere. So that came from that book, because that's what the main character did as well. And then I was mainly listening to, for factual information, I was mainly listening to podcasts, and I was reading studies. I forgot the name of the study, but if you Google dementia study Japan, independency, it will come up. So that was my main point of reference. But the only book I read was a fictional book, and it was called Elizabeth is Missing. Yeah, I watched a lot of films that related to the subject matter as well, a lot of short films, and that really helped as well. You're welcome.
I think that's it. Thank you very much, Kathrin, for this very interesting masterclass.
Thank you. Yeah, and so sorry again that some films didn't work, and because the internet, I don't know what was the issue, but
Internet
I hope
is
it's
not
still
stable at all.
Okay. Yeah, I figured, but I hope you could still get a good sense, even though it was a bit interrupted. So thanks for your patience.
واشجعكم كمان انكم تتفرجوا النهارده على الفيلم اللي في الاخر، لان هو برضو يعني جزء كبير منه هو انيميتد دوكيومنتري بس ان ستوب موشن. الفيلم هيبدا الساعه 8:30 او 9 الا ربع. هو فيلم ايطالي اسمه No Dogs or Italians Allowed. وبرضو ارشح لكم فيلم فلي